maybe it'll give some context to the whole OAuth discussion, as well as maybe you can try it out things, because the next part of this series will be where we'll be exposing to the Graph APIs and trying to upload and download files from SharePoint if required. The way I understand things, as in I don't go so deep into things, but at least I need to know conceptually how things work. And that's where the OAuth discussion today comes into picture. Because if you go on internet, start looking at OAuth specific to Business Center, maybe you'll get a very limited knowledge about it. Because if it is only talking about in context of Business Center, but it's a very commonly used protocol or framework in non-Business Central related. And I guess you need to understand the context of OAuth other than Business Central, so that then you can apply the same logic while you're working on Business Central. And it's not just limited to SharePoint or any other connections, more or less, as in you can connect it to LinkedIn or Facebook or your Google Drive using the OAuth authorization, sorry. That's what I learned today. But the concept of it, it's very important so that you understand it, and then you have a wider framework when you start building your custom applications. So today, if you're here, we are only going to talk about the concept of OAuth. And I would like to be interactive. If you have any questions based on whatever I've learned today or yesterday, we can talk about it. Otherwise, next time when we meet, then our context will be more toward Business Central. But this is a general concept about OAuth. Okay, so let's start with the normals. If you are here for the first time, this is the link where you get registered every week. This link normally gets updated after this meeting. And I should not have clicked it, but okay. Then if you are here in the meeting and don't want to register every week, you can just drop your name and email in the chat, and I'll make you default attendee. So to start OAuth discussions, let's first understand, maybe there are some questions which I was also not clear about. And I read some articles, I read a kind of a book PDF to understand what OAuth is, because as I was saying in the beginning, I was a little bit confused about the Oauth framework. Is it used for authentication or authorization? Because before yesterday, I was thinking there's a specific scenario that you use OAuth for, but I was completely wrong. So do you think is it used for authentication or authorization is the question? Does anyone know about it? Okay, so the OAuth framework, where the auth is authorization, not authentication. So it doesn't help you in authenticating as a user. It helps the process to kind of authorize by you that yes, this application is authorized to operate on my behalf with these certain set of restricted resource, I would say. And we'll talk about it, what that means. So let's remember, OAuth is not for authentication, it's for authorization. For authentication on top of OAuth, there is a separate extension, more or less, if you think it from the Business Center perspective, called OpenID, which takes care of authentication. But the whole OAuth framework is just to authorize. So now when we are talking about authorize, what it authorize? Does it authorize the user, or does it authorize the service? So because it's only authorizing, not authenticating, it actually authorizes a service, not a user. So the whole OAuth framework is for service authorization. So whenever you think about OAuth. Keep these things in mind because I always thought that OAuth is for authentication, which was completely wrong. And then it's for authorization of a service when you are working on a service. So let's understand what that means. So it's an industry standard for authorization, as we learned in the previous slide. Let's understand the key player in this whole framework of OAuth. The first one is for sure is a user, which is you, me, who's sitting in front of a computer and have access to things. Then the second thing is an application, which I'm trying to access. And while I'm trying to talk to that application, I might need some info from another application where I'm authorized to. And maybe I'll show you with an example what I mean by that. And that's where comes the second application, which I was talking about, an API framework of that application. And this API framework of that target application is kind of segregated into two parts. One is an authentication server and one is a resource server. So let's maybe understand it with a simple example. If I have a browser open somewhere, well, let me open it. Okay, so what we want to do, and maybe this is the example that I just tried. So let's assume you are into listening to music using Spotify, and you have seen this framework or uses of OAuth in so many places when you're working daily. So when you reach to a website, and most of the website have these options now, you can create an account here as with providing all these info. But on top of it, you get two options at this point on this website is you can sign up with Facebook or you can sign up with Google. Now here, taking this as an example, I'm the user in this case who's trying to access an application, which is Spotify in this case. But I don't want to get into hassle of creating a separate account, remembering the username and the password, because I already have so many passwords for different websites that I have. So this application, in this case, is allowing me to sign up with any of these websites if I have an account. If I have a Google account, then I can use it to sign up with the Google. And if I have a Facebook account, then I can sign up with the Facebook. So in this scenario, this API is kind of will be selected based on what I choose. So if I choose Facebook, then the API will be selected from Facebook and we'll see what happens next. Behind the scene, this API is kind of divided into an authentication server and a resource server. Any questions at this point before we move forward from here? So the other thing that we need to remember when we are dealing with OAuth is traditionally all other authentication mechanism that we had were used to store user IDs and password in their system so that you can authenticate that. So let's take an example. If you're on a website which helps you to print some photos and then they print it and they ship it to your home. And you keep on getting this request from your customers that we need to have a way to pick our files from, let's say, Google Images. Now, the traditional method, let's say, I guess it's 10-year-old or what? Before 10 years ago, what used to happen is you will have to go to your Google Drive or your Google Photos, download those photos, and then provide it to this printing website. And then they'll print it and send it to you. Then there was some website who said, okay, give me your username and password here. I'll make sure that they get removed as soon as you have done your printing. And we'll log into your account and show you all the pictures, which was not a safe option still today, or was not even the safe option back then, because the third party is storing your credentials. And that's where the need came of a framework which works seamlessly and there are no credentials stored. There is very limited or restricted permission given to that third-party application so that it can access your other account and fetch certain information that it needs, and does it work, and you're done with it. So with the whole framework of OAuth, what happens is, let's say this is the printing service. I log into their website and I say I need to print some photos, but my photos are on Google Drive. There will be a button to kind of log into Google Drive. As soon as I click on it, it'll navigate my browser URL to a Google server, to a Google authentication server, where I need to authorize that I am the user with my username and password, but I'm not entering it in this application. I'm actually entering it into the Google space at this point. Google validates that user ID and password, or if you have multi-factor authentication, you get a notification on your phone, you approve it, and then Google prompts you something saying that this application on which you logged in and clicked on this button is requesting access to these things, which is, let's say, your photos. Do you want to authorize this application to access this area in your Google domain, or in your Google space? If you allow it as a owner of that account, then this application just get that restricted access to that area, which is the photos area. And then based on some other mechanism that's running behind the scene, we'll look at it. It fetches those images which you have selected, print it out, and the connection breaks at that point. So it's more secure because you're not storing any kind of credential on this application, which is a third-party application. Anything that you are authorizing yourself is on the Google domain or Microsoft domain, wherever you are, and then giving the limited set of permission that this application need to do its work. So with the OAuth, you never have your password saved. It's just a framework that talks between servers to server by taking user consent to make sure that this application is allowed to access that particular area. Okay, so how that all happens behind the scene. Let's understand the flow. We understand that there's a user and then there is an application. On the other hand side, there's an authorization server. So again, let's say this is Spotify and this is my Facebook because I'm trying to log in via Facebook on Spotify. So the first thing that happens is this application, when I click on this button here, which is sign up with Facebook, it will send a request to the Facebook authorization server saying, I need an access to Saurav's account because he wanted to access some things from Facebook into my third-party application. As soon as it gets that request, the Facebook authorization server, it says, okay, sounds good. But what you see here is you get a pop-up notification on your screen. So as a user, when I click on this, it will redirect me to my Facebook servers, the authorization server of Facebook, and ask me specifically who needs that permission and what kind of permission they need. Not just who needs it, but what kind of permission they need. It says Spotify is requesting access to your Facebook account, and they only want to read your name and profile picture. So I know what this third-party service is requesting and what they are requesting. And I can, at that point, decide that, oh, am I okay with these consent that they want? And if so, then I can authorize it. Otherwise, I can cancel it. So this is what's happening at this point. So once a user authorized this, saying continue as Saurav at this point, the authorization is granted back to the application. That yes, the owner of this resource or this account have allowed you to read only these limited set of information, which in this case of Spotify is your name and profile picture. and I allow you to move forward. But that's not it. If it allows it, then it says that I've granted you, and then the application calls back again to authorization server that, okay, if the user have granted the consent of allowing you, then give me something based on which I can move ahead and read those info. Sorry. Then in this scenario, what happens is authorization server sends user back an access token, which provides him the right to access the limited resources for which user allowed him to do it. So at this point, once user given the consent, sorry, the authorization server returns back the access token to the application. So now application have access token, but the authorization server in most of the scenarios is a different server than where your resources are. Which means right now, the page where I'm interacting to actually does not have my Facebook account detail. It doesn't know who I am. It doesn't know what my profile picture look like. It doesn't know what my name is. It just says that based on the consent, the user who clicked on this action on your application, I'm able to read that he's Saurabh, but I don't know his profile picture or his name. It's just his user account that he created with Facebook. So the authorization server cannot give access to the resources. It can just give you an access token, which going forward will be used to read to access the detail that this application needs. So once the authorization server returns the access token, what comes next into the picture is the resource server, which would be my Facebook account in this case. So once the application have the access token, it can actually go to resource server with that access token and say, hey, your authorization server have validated me as a right application because the user have authorized this, and your authorization server have given me this access token to read information about so and so account, which is in this case sort of account. So if this application would try to read my email, it'll get an error message here because the scope that it's limited to read is just my name and profile picture. If it asks for anything else other than what is allowed by user, the resource server will reject that request. So it's not how you're connecting, it's also what kind of resources you are exposing to the third party application. So if it is asking the right request with the right access token that has been written by the authorization server, the resource server says yes, or looks good. You have this protected resource or the resources that were allowed by the user to be accessed. And now you can use this and do whatever you want to do in your application. My interaction with you is over. So this is the whole OAuth flow behind the scene that runs when you use OAuth in any third-party application. But now the problem is that how Facebook authorization server will know that this application is a genuine application, and I'll interact with that application. Is it a valid application that I can interact with? So for that, what happens is that there is a second part of how the API server validate that it's the right application, which is a different flow, which you also have to do if you're working on any OAuth application, which is again the creator of the application, which in this case can be anyone who created this application outside the, in this case, the Facebook environment. And the other side is the API server, in this case, the Facebook. Goes to API server with these three details. That this is the name of my application. This is the website that my application have. And if everything goes well, then you need to call back to this URL. So with these three info, the application tries to interact with the API server, and these info pass to API server. Now API server reviews this, validate this, what kind of permission, like in this case, the Spotify would have created a application on the Facebook servers with these three details. And then once this get registered on the Facebook side or on the Facebook API server, the API server returns it a unique client ID and a unique client secrets. Now, remember this, we are talking about the application, we're not talking about the user. So right now, this application of Spotify would have said, see, this is my name, Spotify, this is my website. If everything, while a user is trying to interact using my application, if everything goes well, then you redirect him to this callback URL. To uniquely identify this application in the Facebook domain where there will be so many applications available, it gives it a unique client ID and a client secret, which uniquely identify this application on the Facebook environment. So this is kind of behind the scene workflow that the application developer, in case of if you're building it for Business Central, we will be those guys who will build it and get the unique client ID and client secret for our application on that particular domain where we are talking about. And then based on these client ID and secret, in our previous workflow, let me go back there if I can. The first request of authorization will kind of validate at the Facebook server that yes, it is one of the application which is registered with me with this client ID and with this client secret. So before going into the OAuth workflow, you first have to register your application into that target domain which you are targeting. Like in this case of Spotify, which you are seeing on my screen, which is this. The Spotify would have registered this app, whatever that app is, unique, on the Facebook developer, what they call it, developer site or something like that. And based on that, it passes this. If you see here on the URL, a client ID, and then you see here the OAuth. So based on this client ID that is passed, the Facebook understand that yes, it is an application which is registered with me, and I know what kind of information it needs because it have defined that scope, because this is defined in the beginning while you are registering your application. So I'll understand it when it tries to interact with me, when a user clicks on that action and asks for that. Does that make sense, or any confusions on that point? Okay. So once this happens, your flow more or less is over, which is mainly divided into two parts. The first part is this, that you create an application on the target space where you want to consume from. Like in case of if you want to read files from, let's say, SharePoint, you'll have to create an application in Azure AD. If you are trying to read a file from, let's say, Amazon, what we call that, Amazon S3, I forgot the name, whatever that Amazon file sharing services are, you'll have to have your application registered there. And that's how this HTTP interaction will happen, because it will require you to have a client ID and a client secret to then go and then follow the flow for the user. So while doing my thing, while I was trying to explore what else is here, I found a website. Let me see where it is. If I have the URL, which is called as Oauth Debugger. So if you're working on OAuth and you're pretty new, you want to understand how things work there, you can use it. It is independent. It is not related to Microsoft or, for that matter, anywhere else. It's independent. You need to set up your application, You need to have a URI, what the redirect URL is, and things like that. Once you define that, you can test out that is your application is set up correctly. Can you fetch the token based on that application which you have registered? And I actually have an application available on my Azure AD. So what I'll do is I'll input those info here, okay, and see, can I fetch the token? Is it correctly set or not? This is the client ID of what I was saying is the unique ID that's provided by Microsoft in this case, because I have app registered on the Microsoft domain. And this is the scope that I want to read anything that's available on the graph API space of Microsoft for me. So as soon as I do that, I want to fetch the token, because this is the token that I'll need to do anything else after this point. So is my app registered correctly? Did I set the consent correctly? Did I define the scope correctly? This will only help you to understand that your application is set up correctly and have the correct scope. So once you define all this, you can just send a request. And as you do so, it'll ask you for which account. Now, I'm not using my Archpoint account, my personal account. I'm using one of my free Microsoft account. And let me key in that. So this is that picture, if you remember, where the user is getting the application is getting consent from user that it's need you to validate that you are the right user who is doing this, and then will allow application to read that. Okay, it's a complex password that I've set. Okay, hope so. I entered it correctly. So it's why. Okay, so this went wrong. My username or password, I guess, went wrong. And if you see here, it ended up on that redirect URL that I have defined there, which is businesscentraloauthlanding.com. And you can set it up anything. So let's set it up again. Let me try that again. And this time I'll try to copy and paste it. See what happens. Okay, so this page isn't working. So my redirect URL, maybe I'll have to do it on the same browser where I'm in. So let me go back there. Okay, close this. Open my environment and let me try to browse it here. Okay. So this is the debugger. Let's try to fetch the domain, and this is my redirect URL. If anything goes wrong or if anything succeeds, we come back here, and then my scope. Okay, let's try to send the request. Okay, it's the same user, but it seems this page is not working. Okay, I should have correctly set my redirect URL. That means that in my application, whatever I have said, the redirect URL is set incorrectly. So let me this time skip the redirect URL and see what happens. Okay. There was one. Everything looks good. I don't need a space, state, and here, code, and then send the request. Okay, so for this application, response type token is not enabled. So when I was setting this up, I need to make sure that I have the right response type enabled for a different for an application that I've created, and we'll talk about it in a while. Let me go back and see, can I fetch code from it or not? Okay. Thanks. does not match. Okay, so it should match. Okay, so the app surely have some problems. Let's navigate to that app and see how I can grant access. And then maybe if we have time, we'll talk about how I created this app if required. So this is the app. What it is talking about the redirect URL that I was talking about, you define it here, which is I have set it up for this page. We'll talk about why, because this was specific to Business Central. Then this is what you get when you register a new app and unique application ID for this application. And this is what I was entering while I was trying to debug this in the debugger, which is not working for some reason. Other than that, the other unique thing that you will see would be in the secrets that you need, as we are talking about in this, that it returns you a client ID, which is this ID when you talk about the Microsoft space, and the client secrets are one time visible, so you can't actually see them once you have created them and if you haven't stored them. If you see, I have three here. So the way it works is when you create a new client secret, you need to give it a name, and then you need to define how long the secret is valid. The maximum time, I guess, at this point is 24 months. So after every 24 months, I'll have to come and update my secret in my app that I'm creating. So as soon as I do that, I get a new secret, which is here. But as soon as I go out of this page, this secret will be hashed out. So I cannot see it again if I haven't copied it to clipboard. The other thing about what we are talking about is what access this application will have is you define in the permissions of this API. So if you see here, I already have some permissions about SharePoint, but if you have to add a new permission, you can do a add permission, and then it shows you, well, maybe let's create one from the beginning so that we understand it at least from the Microsoft space. So when you create a new app, and this is what you need to kind of talk to Business Central from an external entity. So if you are trying to read the API data from, let's say, Postman, you need an application here so that you can generate your token out of it. So let's say this is demo app. Now here you decide who can use this application. Is it just for this particular tenant where you are in, or do you want to access it in the organization directory on a Azure AD if it is a multi-tenant environment, or you want to kind of be it restricted? So you can choose it there. More or less, in a typical Business Central scenario, I think this will be, fulfilling your most of the requirement. And then the redirect URL is where you want to redirect if the interaction is successful with this app. And you can define, in this case, Business Central. You can even specify a specific page if you want. So the standard is what was not working, which was this. For SaaS, for on-prem, you change it with your web server, your server instance name, and yeah, your server name and then your service name, just to be very correct. Yes, where you have hosted your service, that server path. And then for SaaS, it's kind of standardizing to this. Once you do that, you register this. It just creates a new app with this name. Once it gets created, you surely get an application ID, which is required for any kind of interaction. And the other thing that you need to define is the secrets. So as I was doing earlier, the same method is done to define a secret. Like Okay, you define the secret. It is here. This value will be lost once it is done, and you have copied it. Then you move to what this application who have this application ID will have access to. Then you go into the permission of this app, and then you define what kind of permissions you need. And here is the whole spectrum of Microsoft, because we are talking about the Microsoft apps. It gives you access to Graph. It gives you access to your Business Central if you need. So in case of you are doing an API call to Business Central from an external third-party application, then you'll choose Dynamics 365 Business Central. And then when you choose an application here in the Microsoft space, it asks you what kind of permissions you need. Is it a delegate permission or an application permission? And inside these, still then, you can define what specific permission they need. Do they will have access to the sign-in user, or will they have access to read or write data, the data that's in Business Central? In the application permission, it'll give you, can they read write APIs? Can they do automation read write permissions on that? So based on the permission that you define in your app, that will show up in the screen to the user when he or she tries to log into it. Say, will you authorize this application to do this? So that this part is coming on based on when you're registering your application in that platform. So if I have to do something on SharePoint, just to take an example, I can pick this. And if you see here, there will be so many permissions that you can assign very specific. Do you want to give this app while user is shown, does he want to see that, will you allow this application to access all sites? Will you allow this application to read all the sites or write a new site? In the same way, will you allow this application to read files and all? And I think you have also seen it on your mobile application. When you install a mobile application, it says, I need access to your contacts. I need access for camera, and I need access for, you know, your calling services. And based on what kind of consent you give, that's how that app behaves. So on the similar line, this is considering as a separate app that where you'll be using this, you define what kind of consent it'll ask to the user. So all these are available here, and it's not just limited to Business Central. As I was saying earlier, you can define which kind of info, and because it's Microsoft domain, in the Microsoft space, this application will be talking to. And then even in that space, what restricted resource you will need for your third-party application to work on. So this is the first part where you are the application developer going to that bigger space. Like in this case, I came to Microsoft Azure. If you are going to Facebook, there's a separate Facebook API section. If you are trying to build something which deals with Google, then there's a separate Google API platform, same for Amazon and things like that. And you need to first register your application there and define what user info I'll be requesting permission for so that I can read that. So based on that, you can design that here. So let's say Business Central, and I need read write permission here, just to make it easy. Here, API read all. You define the permission. So once you have defined the permission, there is one more part left because it's right now does not have permission to grant to be read and write. That's where either as an administrator in this, I guess you can do it from here. But if I'm not wrong, in the Business Central space, there is something called as AAD application, if I have read it correctly, where you can register an application and say, okay, I grant this application the permission to interact with Business Central with following details. So with this client ID, and this is my demo app. enable, and then the app ID. Oh, this is the extension ID. I don't need that. You can also define what kind of user group and permissions will be assigned to it. Remember, while you're defining this, you can't define super for any external third-party application that you have. So if you think that these guys will be writing data, this third-party application will be writing data into the central, then you can surely define some limited permission that they have, but they can't be super in your business central environment. So now I know the client ID, the business central knows the client ID. I can here grant the consent for this application, and then the same workflow will trigger. As soon as I clicked on that, the OAuth workflow started. It went to Azure AD and said, the business central application is trying to authorize an application. Do you know anything about this application with this client ID? And if yes, then grant and consent. Now this app would like to access Business Central signed user, which is me. Full access to web service API. Grant full access to Business Central web service API. These API provide capacity. It will provide you all the info. Sign in and read user profile. So now as a Business Central administrator or user, if you agree that, okay, this application was supposed to be doing this, and it makes sense what it is doing, then you can surely grant the consent. Otherwise, you can cancel it and go back to the app developer and say, everything looks good, but I don't want you to have this kind of permission. And then that application developer can surely come back into API permission and, let's say, remove one of these if required. Okay. I don't want it to do the financial read, right? I just wanted to have a permission of API read and write. It says, okay, the third-party application says that, yes, I have made my changes in my application. Please go back and authorize my application. Administrator comes back in, says grant consent. User login pops up, and again, now this list has changed based on whatever the permission set that application have changed. So now this application will only have full access to web service API and will also have access to sign and read user info. Once you do that, it accepts it, and the consent was given successfully. I'm hoping when I come back here, refresh this, the application is granted from Business Central. So now the Business Central administrator has approved this app to do these things. So when you, as a third party, or while making an application and you're registering it on here, even if you have the admin privilege, don't grant consent from here. Let the administrator from the organization decide that will they accept what your application is trying to do. Provide them your application ID, and that's what they need to kind of register it here. And they authorize it, and they define what kind of permission this application will have, and they grant the consent for this application that yes, whatever it is requesting makes sense for the intent of why this app we requested from my partner. So now we have done this part which we were talking about, granting the consent. Now we have the client ID and secret. The Microsoft Space understands this unique application and have all the details that needed. Already have a redirect URL defined, client secret defined. Now the only thing that I can do with this application ID and client secret is read and write the API data from this particular tenant. So if I try to use these details to kind of read data from SharePoint, I'll surely fail, because that's not the intention of this particular app. Maybe I have a separate app just to read files and write files into SharePoint or OneDrive. I'm pretty sure there will be a OneDrive permission set that's available. So while you're building your third-party application, make sure that you define the right permission that your application will need to do whatever it needs to be done. And then let the user or the administrator on the organization approve or grant the consent of that application rather than you going here and saying, oh, because by mistake, customer have given me admin consent, so I can just click on this button and grant that consent here. Okay, so that's more or less about what I've read. There's one more thing that I read about it, and maybe that's for a different day. But if you want to play around before we meet next time, this is what I was using, which completely failed. I'll have to test it out why it is not reading the app which is registered on Azure AD. Maybe my app had something wrong. And then once you get the token out, which we are not able to do with this debugger, if you want to go deep into it, which I'm not that much interested into, there is a website called jwp.io, which is, let me open this here. The jwt.io will allow you to decrypt or decode your token that's generated based on this. So here it is. Once you have your JSON token, which looks like something like this, it breaks that token into 3 different parts, as in what it contains. Doesn't literally give you the exact thing that you can read directly, but this payload, this token is actually broken into 3 parts with these dots in separated. And based on these 3 parts, there are different kind of details that are used by the third-party app, by the application to verify that yes, this is the authentication that's available, and it provides that detail. So that what kind of happens on more or less on a typical OAuth workflow. And I guess that's all that I was able to dig deep into OAuth, as in whatever I need to know about how OAuth works and how I wanted to kind of understand it before I start talking about how we use it in Business Central. So any questions, thought?
Sarah, this is Steve Endo. I have 2 questions.
Yeah, please.
I have set this up numerous times, but I don't do it frequently enough. And every single time it's like starting from scratch, trying to understand what fields go where. And 2 things you mentioned. One was, did you say you should not routinely click the grant admin consent button?
As in that,
or you should?
As in I don't do it, as in, and maybe the reasoning is I was not given as an admin privilege on that account, right? And then I started searching about it, that how you do it actually.
Now,
and then I ended up with this.
I've read several instructions. I'm positive, because I don't know the implications of that. And several of the instructions I have read, like for giving access to the Business Central APIs, I'm pretty sure they always just routinely say grant admin consent. And I don't know if those instructions are correct or they know, but from my impression is it's very common for people to say, oh, just grant admin consent. So I think your comment might be accurate. It's interesting, and it's an area for further research.
Yeah, so what happened last week, and I guess that's where I learned it, a customer needed an app for doing something, and we were building an app for them in Business Central. So we needed an app registered on Azure, and the administrator from there said, I have given you permission to go into our Azure and create an app. I said, okay. I went there, I defined the permission that I needed for that app. And because I didn't have the full administrator right, this button was disabled for me. So then I actually went searching that if I'm not the administrator of Azure and I'm trying to make an application which will interact with Business Central, then how you authorize it? Or either I'll have to sit with the administrator and say, okay, go into this screen, click on this, or rather I'll say, okay, here it is defined. Can you just click on this button of grant consent and approve by looking at it what this application is actually trying to read from your Business Central environment.
Right. So you're essentially controlling the permissions from within Business Central, not through Azure as a blanket admin consent. Is that?
Yes. So as in at this point, user knows what this application will be doing,
Mhm.
right? And then he or she decides that yes, this is what I gave to Saurav, and I wanted Saurav to read or write from the Business Central account. So that's
Okay.
kind of letting them approve what your app will be doing with Business Central. As in, yeah,
But in your
most I will
Azure
say,
page,
yeah,
it says grant admin consent. It is granted.
yeah, it's already granted now. Yeah.
Okay, but that occurred through Business Central, not
Yes.
through
So
Azure.
yeah. So if I remove this, let's do it again.
Oh, I
So
didn't realize those were connected.
yes. So if I go ahead and say, okay, this app needs, okay, let's say graph, delegated permission to read my emails, which I can do
Mhm.
behind the scene. If I'm given the admin privileges on that AD, right? And then I say this emails and profile, okay. And then if I also need access on financial data read write as well as API read write. It seems it's already done, so I'll have to remove this permission.
Hmm.
No,
Okay,
remove consent.
it was just interesting to hear you say that, because I'm pretty sure the instructions I followed, like I'm just blindly following them. They just say,
Yeah.
oh, grant admin consent from here.
So let's say this button is disabled at this moment, right?
Yep.
And these are the permission that my app needed. So if I go here and say, user, I have defined this, can you just go ahead because I don't have permission to grant consent? Can you do that? And
Mhm.
the user comes here, logs into his account, based on his account. Then he sees what this application needs. And
Got
because
it.
right now this is not enabled, I can
Yep.
then, as an administrator, come here and say, accept this. I know what this application is trying to do. Refresh it here. Let's get refresh. Okay, it should get refreshed. Okay.
Okay, so in theory, that
Okay.
authorization from Business Central should show up in Azure there.
Yes,
Okay, got it.
and that's what happened. Maybe I'll have to kind of reset this. Maybe it's already stored somewhere.
No problem. Got it.
Yeah, but that's
Okay.
the whole idea. That
And the second thing that has always confused me is the redirect URI. I simply cannot find a consistent URI. Like every tutorial, every document, it's like, oh, you just enter your redirect URI. They don't specify what that should be for any given application. Is there a documented URI for the Business Central redirect?
uh, what I have read is also the same, which I was specifying here about the redirect URI is a static Business Central URI here, but the way it works is when that pop-up window pops up, right, where you authorize that application and give your consent,
Uh-huh.
then what window it redirect to. So like, let's say you're on a customer page where you're trying to authorize it, and then if it gets authorized, you want to move to a different page, then you can actually have the whole URL here and you just navigate there. So it's just a way to kind of redirect when things are done. So with an access token. So if you are on one page and if the authentication happens, let's say you are on a login page, you created a page where user can enter username and password. And
Okay.
then when they click on it, it pops up that notification to grant consent and they approve it. And then if that consent is given, you want to navigate to, let's say, customer page, then that will by default become your redirect URI. And you can
But
define that static here.
It's not typically a specific page,
Yeah,
right? It's
it's not.
typically like
Yeah.
the root
Yes.
URI or URL, right?
Right.
Okay.
So
I'm trying to pull up mine right now, but most of the instructions, they just say, oh, paste in your redirect URI. And
right.
I have no idea what that should be. I can guess, and I'm not clear what the implications are, but I mean, that could just be me.
Yeah, as in that's why I started looking at OAuth from not from the business center perspective, because it was a little bit confusing when you think it with a very limited scope of business center. So I just wanted to understand conceptually how OAuth, being used in
Right.
the bigger space, so that now I'll have a context of it, and now I'll understand why this application was created in AD. And then when I use my OAuth in my code in the next session, I'll understand what parameters I need and why I need it and where I should store them and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't find my published app, so I'll have to go find it, see what I use for redirect URIs for my OAuth. And
Yeah, Business
also,
Central also, Microsoft article also talks about that static URI that, I guess you were also talking about.
yeah.
So, yeah.
And also, when I'm using Postman with to test Business Central APIs,
Mm-hmm.
I was unable to get the service-to-service authentication or service-to-service flow to work. So I'm using a user interactive auth. And so every 5 minutes, I'm having to re-authenticate with Business Central, reset the
There's a
token,
token
and
expires, yeah.
Postman. It's such a hassle. So there's an entire confusing realm of the different flows, and like it's a very humbling experience to try to figure this out, unfortunately. I do
Yeah,
not see how customers are going to navigate this, honestly. Like, I appreciate that Microsoft is trying to tighten up security, but going from a
right.
very simple web API key to OAuth, I find it so confusing personally.
Yes, and that I get that's we are also seeing it with most of the customer who are using APIs outside the center.
Yeah,
And because there
yeah,
are different kind of application which we may not know how to kind of change that code more or less to use
right.
OAuth, it's a
Yeah,
little bit hard on them
yeah.
for sure.
Okay, anyway, just my venting.
That's
Okay, thank you for the session.
not a problem. Okay, so as I said, I'm out for next 2 weeks. So we'll meet now on June 4th of June, and maybe we'll cover some scenarios as Steve was saying about Postman, so that we understand the whole token flow, how it happens, and then we'll get into other things like SharePoint, reading files, writing files into SharePoint, how easy it becomes once you understand the whole OAuth flow. And then I'm currently working on an Amazon S3 integration, so maybe we'll talk about that if that makes sense till that point, how you read and write from Amazon S3, because all you need is to set up this what we talked about today, defining your application, having your secrets and application ID, have a way to fetch the token, store them, and then rest all is very simple HTTP calls that you need to make to read or write on these different platforms. So we'll start working on those next time when we meet and see how that goes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saurav.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Saurav.
Thanks.